Hello, and welcome back to part two of my Government Foundations lecture. So in this video, you will be able to understand four different schools of thought about the distribution of power in society and in our government, and you will be able to evaluate how power is divided in various governmental structures. So we're going to discuss who has the power, but before we talk about power in politics or in government, we first need to clarify two key terms: authority and legitimacy. So authority is who has the right to use power, and legitimacy is political authority conferred by law or a nation's constitution, right? In the United States, people are socialized to accept authority or the rule of law, and this gives the government legitimacy, right? A government needs legitimacy to exercise authority. So in the United States, we believe that our Constitution is legitimate. We believe in it. It's the rule of law. No one's questioning that. And as a result, we believe that our government has the authority to tell us what to do. So keep those terms in mind as we talk here about different theories of political power. Before we start, I'm going to talk to you about two sides of a political theory coin here. So number one is elitism politics, right? So this is ruled by an identifiable group of people who possess a disproportionate share of political power. These are referred to as the political elite, right? So a small group of people who have all the power and who are in charge. This often occurs, elitism politics, when the issue is clear and is not clear and is very complex. So a recent example of that would be the debate over Obamacare and healthcare policy. Healthcare policy is extremely complicated. It's not something that most Americans know a lot about. And so that is why there are very few people in the United States right now trying to create healthcare policy and making decisions about healthcare policy. That is an example of elitism politics. The flip side of that is majoritarian politics. This is when leaders very closely follow the will of the people, right? They do exactly what the people would do, what they think the people would do if the people were going to come out and vote on it. This doesn't happen very often because you need three things to occur in order for majoritarian politics to work. And you should write these down. Number one, the issue has to be simple and clear so people can understand it. Number two, it has to be an issue that interests most people so that they're engaged and they're all reading and talking about it. And number three, there has to be a feasible way to address what the public wants accomplished. There has to be a clear solution. This does not occur very often, okay? But we can see the tension between these two types of politics, right? A broad participatory model like majoritarian politics versus more filtered participation like the elite model, right? We see this tension throughout this unit in the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, which we'll talk about, and in different aspects of the U.S. Constitution. So I'm going to discuss four power distribution theories. In other words, who governs, right? Who has the power? Who's making the decisions? The first one is the Marxist theory or the class view, right? And you've probably all heard of Karl Marx or studied Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto sometime in your high school career. But just a refresher that the Communist Manifesto was written in 1848, and it's the theory of class struggle, right? Karl Marx thought that all the conflict in history was steeped in class struggle. And he said that the bourgeoisie, the rich people, would always take advantage of the proletariat, the poor people, right? And he predicted a violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie. So the Marxist theory or class view argues that governments are dominated by capitalists and business owners, right? That in the American capitalist system, the people with the power are wealthy businessmen, right? Today, people who hold a Marxist theory or a class view, for the most part, are less dogmatic than Karl Marx was. And they emphasize the power of the rich and multinational corporations, but they don't necessarily advocate for the violent overthrow part. The second theory that I want to briefly discuss is the power elite view. And this was given to us by C. Wright Mills, who was writing about it in 1956. And according to Mills, democracy is dominated by influential members who are working outside of government. Military, labor leaders, mass media execs, special interests, right? These aren't elected officials. But these people who are working outside of government, according to Mills, are the people that have the most power. He didn't think that they were necessarily bad people or that they were all conspiring against us. He just believed that they were raised and born into similar circumstances and that they weren't necessarily the most famous or visible people. Like, the average Joe wouldn't necessarily know who they are, but they did control society's important choices. According to Mills, there was a power elite triangle, if you will, that these three sides of the triangle are the people who held the power and shared the power in the United States in the 1950s. So we thought corporate leaders, military leaders, and political leaders were the power elite. And notice that two sides of this triangle are people who weren't even elected, right, into a government office. Today, we might argue that the media should take the place of military leaders, right? Mills placed them here if you think about the context of the time that he was working in 1956. The height of the Cold War, right? It makes sense that he would put the military here. But today we might think, with how ubiquitous our 24-hour news cycle is, that the media maybe is part of the power elite today. You should have this triangle in your notes. The third view is the bureaucratic view given to us by Max Weber, who was working in the late 1800s. And it is just what it says, right? The bureaucratic view argues that bureaucrats actually hold the power. These are non-elected officials. They're appointed by the president. And he says their job is to implement public policy and laws. But he says, no, they don't just implement policies, they actually make policies. So when I talk about bureaucratic agencies, and we'll spend time on this year, I'm talking about the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, or the FDA, right, the Food and Drug Administration, or the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. According to Weber, these are the people who held the political power. Our final view is the pluralist view. This is an argument that says that no single elite has a monopoly on power. Right? It's the belief that competition among groups or factions, and we'll talk about this word a lot, factions. A faction is a group with a distinct political interest. Let me say that again. A faction is a group with a distinct political interest. So the pluralist view believes that this competition among factions shapes public policy, right? That there are so many rivalries between these factions that eventually these factions will have to come to some type of compromise, right? No one holds all the power. And one of the earliest arguments for pluralism came from my man here, James Madison, who we will discuss a lot, who in Federalist 10 talks about factions. And he says that at first he's worried about factions, right? And he's worried that about the infighting that factionalism could lead to. But eventually he comes to the conclusion that factions actually might be good for democracy. It's best to just let competing factions do their thing, because it would prevent anyone from dominating the political system, right? It would separate the power among a lot of different groups. So briefly here, I want to discuss how the power is divided. So there are three ways we see power divided in government. And you can pause me at any time to look at this slide more closely. But you should have these down in your notes. So first is the unitary system. The unitary system, in a unitary system, the Constitution gives the central government all the power, which then dictates power down to regional governments like state governments and the people, right? So the central government would be like the federal government or the national government. The United States was considered unitary under the rule of Great Britain, right? From 1607 to 1775. On the flip side of that, we have the confederal system. This is when the Constitution gives all the power to regional governments, which are state governments, which then dictates down to the central government, which is the national or the federal government, and the people. In our history in the United States, we've had two instances of confederations. One was from 1777 to 1877 when the United States was under the Articles of Confederation, and the other was from 1861 to 1865 during the Civil War when Southern states broke away from the Union and they were called the Confederate States of America. Finally, we have a federal system, and this is what we have today. This is uniquely American, where our Constitution gives power, distinct powers, to both regional governments, state governments, and our federal government, which then dictates down to the people. These two types of government, federal government and state government, share the power. And these powers are called then concurrent powers, when a power is shared at the same time between national and state governments, i.e. the ability to tax, build roads, etc. Those are some examples of concurrent powers. All right, thank you for listening. See you soon.